Paul's associated with a lot of churches. So how many churches did Paul have? He had a ministry of 30 years. Let's just say he wrote each church twice a year. Okay, you've got 20 churches. He writes each of them twice a year. That's 40. And he did it for 30 years. That's 1,200 letters. We've got 7. They start out by saying, what do you know about the Gospel of Judas? I said, well, we don't have a Gospel of Judas. A National Geographic woman's on this phone and asked me what I think of the Gospel of Judas. And she said, well, would you think it's significant if we found it? Would I think it's significant? Yes, it'd be significant. She said, well, we think we got it. Song of Songs is an interesting case. There's really nothing about it particularly in Solomon. I mean, it's about a young man who is passionate about a young woman. They're both gorgeous, and the reason they did that is because they started to allegorize it. So that in ancient Israel, the standard allegory was that this is not talking about a young man and a young woman who have the hots for each other. This is talking about God's love for his people Israel.
MythVision. Welcome back to MythVision Podcast, another show with Dr. Bart D. Ehrman, and I hope you're doing well today, Dr. Ehrman.
I am. So far, so good.
Last time, I think you had COVID. I'm not going to lie. Your cough was pretty...
I didn't have COVID, but I did have a cold.
Yeah, it was pretty heavy. So I was like, what is going on?
Yeah, man, I tested. It wasn't COVID. That's yet to come.
Well, let's hope that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
We'll jump right in if that's okay with you.
Yeah, great.
Question number 1. What is your opinion regarding the hypothesis put forth by Walter Bauer during the last century that most of the earliest Christian communities for which there is available information were heretical in their beliefs by the standards of the Proto-Orthodox Church?
Right. So, do you mind if I provide a little bit of background? Walter Bauer was a German theologian and lexicographer. His Greek dictionary is still the one everybody uses who does Greek New Testament. I mean, he was a very famous philologist and thinker. And he wrote this book called Orthodoxy and Heresy in Earliest Christianity. It came out in 1934. He wrote it in German. And he argued that the traditional way of understanding heresy and orthodoxy was wrong. What people thought for many centuries, going back to the 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries, was that Christianity started out as a single thing. Jesus taught his disciples the truth. They passed it off to their followers. The bishops of the churches were in that line, and so the truth had always been handed on, and you find it in the Nicene Creed, and you find it in the Bible. It's like it's all been one thing, and every now and then there'd be some heretic who comes along who decides to mess things up, and he's either willful or stupid or demon inspired, usually demon inspired, and he'll end up saying something else, like there are 2 gods, not just one God, or Jesus isn't really human and divine, he's just divine, or just human. And so you have these heretics coming along every now and then twisting the truth. And so with that model, that model that was made especially famous by the church historian Eusebius in the early 4th century, in that model, what we think of orthodoxy, the correct belief is original. It goes back all the way. It's what the majorities always thought. And heresies are these kind of offshoots, Bauer came along in 1934 and said, no, that's probably not right. What Bauer did is he went region by region throughout Christianity. So he went to Egypt. He didn't go there. I mean, he writes about Egypt. He writes about Syria. He writes about Asia Minor. He writes about Rome. And he finds the earliest surviving evidence for what Christianity was in each of these places. And it turns out our earliest evidence for all of these places, like solid evidence of what's going on in Syria, is almost always what later came to be called heresies. So that the earliest form in most of the places he surveys was not orthodox. So what he argues is that it's not that there was one thing that came down from Jesus all the way down and there are these offshoots. It's that in early Christianity, there were lots of different groups with lots of different views, and that they fought it out, and they tried to get more converts, and some got more converts than others, and eventually one form emerged this form that emerged called itself Orthodox, believing the right things, and said that everybody else was a heresy. And then they rewrote the history of the engagement. And so, what is my opinion about that? I think it's right. I mean, Bauer. I don't think Bauer's specifics are right. I mean, Bauer. He was writing. He was writing. In the 1930s. So 90 years ago he was doing this, and we've learned a lot about Christianity since then. But one thing I think we do know is that there were lots of different kinds of Christianity from the very beginning. I mean, just read. Sorry, I'm going on about this one, but it's like a big point in my scholarly career is showing that this is the basic view is probably right. Even when you get to the go back as far as the New Testament, people don't really appreciate the fact that every time Paul writes a letter, he's got enemies who are Christians that he's trying to refute. Well, if we had their letters, it'd be really interesting to because we just think, well, everybody was kind of agreed with Paul, right? Yeah, except for all the people he's writing to. And so I think that probably Bauer's were basically right, and that it's even more complicated than he thought, and maybe even more diverse than he thought early on.
Thank you so much. That was really well put. I appreciate it. Question number 2, and it's some of these might be a little bit longer just to get my question out and the ideas around it. It's not for you; it's technically for the audience to kind of keep up with me. So, do you have an opinion or have come across any scholarly publications or discussions on whether Jesus and/or Paul may have suffered from mental illness, as recognized by 21st century science? It is safe to say both were inside the apocalyptic bubble of their day, and their false predictions about the return of the Son of Man, Jesus, or Jesus himself, Paul were made on this basis. However, Mark does say Jesus' family thought him mad when he first preached in Nazareth. Were they right? Also, Jesus supposedly talked to the devil during his temptation and may have thought he was the promised Messiah. In the case of Paul, the vision he had on the Damascus Road appears to have been one of the many, since he was also mentioned being transported up to the third heaven in another passage, as well as additional instances of receiving revelations. Neurologists have discovered there's a part of the brain that, when stimulated, will cause a person to have visions with thoughts, taking on religious cast. Do all these actions inspire confidence both men were in their right minds, Dr. Ehrman?
It's a very good question, and I'm sorry to say it is unanswerable. The reason it's unanswerable is because it is very hard to tell when somebody is what you kind of might colloquially say losing their mind, or that they're having some kind of neurological event that is leading to visionary experiences. Even today, when a psychoanalyst can analyze somebody and spend weeks, months, years with them, it's very difficult to analyze what the psychological state is. And neurologists, of course, have to actually do serious neurological tests. We have no way of testing Jesus or Paul, and we don't have enough information about them in order to do any kind of reliable analysis. Just with respect to Jesus, for example, right, the Gospels say that he was talking to the devil in the wilderness. But that doesn't mean that the historical Jesus really thought he was talking to the devil in the wilderness. This is a story told about him. And so it doesn't mean that he actually that he thought he had done that. So the first story we have of this is in the Gospel of Matthew, and it's 85 years later, not 85, it's in about the year 85. So it's about 55 or 60 years after Jesus' life by somebody who didn't know Jesus and probably never talked to anybody who knew Jesus. And he's telling a story he heard. And it doesn't mean that Jesus was really thought that he was talking to the devil the whole time. So we don't know. The other thing is that it's very easy to say that people who have different worldviews from ours are crazy. But it doesn't mean that they're clinically crazy. They might be, but it doesn't mean they're clinically crazy, because people in different worlds. It's so hard for us to understand that people have different worldviews that seem to us to be bizarre, really bizarre. And just because somebody has one of these bizarre worldviews that seems to us to be bizarre doesn't mean they're crazy. It just means that they're brought up in a different world and understanding different things. There are plenty of people today who believe in demons, and they're not crazy. They're not. They might be crazy. I mean, some of them might be, but they're not crazy to believe in demons. I mean, I used to believe in demons. I used to believe I could cast out demons.
Me
It didn't
too.
mean I was out of my mind. It just meant that I had this weird view. And so, yeah. So I don't think you can psychoanalyze somebody 2,000 years later, especially Jesus. You don't even have anything. You don't have any of his writings, let alone recordings of what he said. And so, yeah, I don't think you can do that.
Thank you so much. Question number 3. When the predictions made by Jesus and Paul regarding the appearance of the Son of Man, could be Jesus himself, Paul failed to materialize, they failed to materialize. Do scholars know of any other movements that cropped up within the nascent Christian community to revise these failed predictions prior to the rise of the new prophecy of Montanus in the 170s?
Now that's a complicated question.
I know.
Are people going to know what you're talking about? So
Maybe.
let me unpack it a bit. So Jesus predicted that there was going to be a cataclysmic event where there would be a cosmic judge who came from heaven to judge the earth, and he called this person the Son of Man. In the Gospels, when he talks about the Son of Man, often it's clear he's talking about himself. The Son of Man must go to Jerusalem and be rejected by the scribes and elders and be executed and raised from the dead. So he's talking about himself, the Son of Man, there. But there are other passages in the New Testament where Jesus talks about the Son of Man, and there's nothing to suggest he's talking about himself. That's when he talks about this cosmic judge coming on the earth to judge people for how they live and how they behave. This was a common belief in Jewish apocalyptic thought, that there would be some kind of angelic being or some kind of being that would come and would judge the earth at the end of time, and that it was going to happen soon. Jesus appears to have thought that. Paul, after Jesus' death, also thought that Jesus was coming back. Paul actually never says that the Son of Man is coming. He doesn't use that term, Son of Man, but he does talk about Jesus returning from heaven in judgment. And so Paul appears to have thought that Jesus was this Son of Man that he had heard about Jesus talking, probably heard about Jesus talking about. And so your question is, so that didn't happen, right? And so that's always been a problem for readers of the New Testament, because Jesus does say it's going to happen within his own generation, and that some of his disciples will be alive when it happens, and they obviously weren't. And Paul pretty much says in 1 Corinthians 15 and 1 Thessalonians 4 that he'll be alive when it happens, and that didn't happen. And so your question is, did anybody else continue to think it's going to happen like next week sometime or next month before the Montanists? That's where your question got tricky, because the Montanists were a group of Christians who were theologically, they were just they were proto-Orthodox Christians. They had typical kind of Orthodox beliefs, but they did believe that the end was coming soon and that Jesus was going to come back very soon in their lifetime. And then, in fact, he was going to come to the town of Papuza in what's now Turkey. Yeah, well, that didn't happen either. And so they were a group expecting the imminent end. And the question is, were there people between Paul and the Montanists who thought the end was coming right away? And the answer is yes. There were lots of people. The expectation did fade out over time. And it's interesting, just when you read the early Christian writings themselves, Jesus predicts this in the earliest Gospels, in Matthew and Mark and Luke. He doesn't predict it when you get to the Gospel of John. When you get to later Gospels, like the Gospel of Thomas, he preaches against it. And so clearly, since it didn't happen, people are saying, yeah, he didn't really say that, because otherwise he'd be wrong. But people did continue thinking it was going to happen soon in their own day. And not everyone did, but it continued to be a thing. And it continued to be a thing all through history. I mean, as you know, there are millions of people today who still think that when Jesus said it's going to happen soon, he meant soon for them 2,000 years later. Like,
that is so true.
That's what my next book's about, by the way. The book I've just finished writing is about people thinking it's coming on Thursday.
I really look forward to potentially interviewing you to promote that one, because I'm a fan of looking at this apocalyptic stuff and the rise of Islam in the 7th century. There was a lot going on in the Christian world with this whole, the end is about to happen. And Muhammad may have fit this apocalyptic character in his own little region. So there's something there. Question number 4. What role did the book of Enoch play in the early Christian movement. In his epistle, Jude quotes from this book. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. This is another complicated question, and people may not know the book of Enoch. You're referring actually to First Enoch. There are several books that are in the Enochic literature. Enoch, people may know, is a figure from the Bible. He's the seventh generation descendant from Adam, and so he's the one who was so righteous that God took him up to heaven without dying. And so in Jewish thought, starting a couple hundred years before Jesus, Enoch became a big figure in some circles because people started speculating. These were kind of like Jewish mystics who had this kind of apocalyptic view of things about Enoch as somebody who could reveal the truth. He was a human, so he knows how to communicate to the rest of us, and he was taken up to heaven, so like he's seen a lot up there. And so they have these books that they wrote that are connected with Enoch. The book in which allegedly Enoch is writing what he knows about the heavenly realm and what's about to happen and things like that. So some of these books are apocalyptic in nature. They have this kind of vision of God's in charge, even though it doesn't look like it. And if you see what's really going on in heaven, you'll be able to make sense of what's happening here on earth. The book of First Enoch that we have. So this is going to get even more complicated. The book of Enoch, First Enoch that we have, is actually 5 different writings written by 5 different authors at 5 different times that somebody else spliced together. And so the first one is the most interesting. It's first for me. It's the most interesting. For other people, others are more. But for me, the first one's the most interesting. It's the longest. It's called the Book of Watchers. It's chapters 1 through 36, and it's a riff on this passage in Genesis 6 that people ignore, but they really ought to pay attention to this passage. This is the passage in Genesis 6 before the flood, where the sons of God, who are these angels, look down and see the daughters of men and see that they're beautiful, and they want to have sex with them. And so they come down and they have sex with these women. Excuse me.
It's the angels right now calling.
The angels call and say, "Man, you're in trouble. What are you even talking about here? Prepare to meet thy fate." These angels come down and have sex with, and in one strand of the Genesis story itself, that's why God destroys the world, is because the offspring are giants and they're taking over the place. And so the book of First Enoch, the book of the Watchers, gives an extended account of this, even names who these people are, names their names, talks about what they do and how awful they are and how God punishes them. The book of Jude does quote the book of Enoch, which shows that for the author of Jude, this was an important book. It doesn't necessarily mean that he saw it as a scriptural text. It was not a scriptural text in Judaism historically. It did end up being attributed as having kind of scripture-like qualities, canonical qualities in some parts of Judaism, but it never, of course, made it into the Hebrew Bible. How influential was it on early Christians? It's really hard to say, because there are allusions to it. There may be allusions to it in First Peter, for example. It may be that the author of Revelation knows it. I mean, there are lots of options, but Jude is the only direct quotation that we have in the earliest Christian writings, and so it's hard to know. I mean, would Jesus have known this book? I mean, I doubt it, but it's possible, and so on.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Question number 5. What are the Bodmer papyri and their importance to scholars? Is it true they are generally dated to around 200 and include the earliest extant versions of Jude and 1st and 2nd Peter, plus major portions of the Gospel of John, which in turn excludes the story of the woman taken in adultery? Also, aren't some pagan works included, such as 3 previously unknown plays by the Greek playwright Menander?
Am I in a doctoral exam here? What? The Bodmer papyri? Wow.
If you don't, I have to say to our audience up front, like, I did not play, like, I didn't throw this at you and say, hey, here's some time for you to prep or anything. It was just, off the cuff, you know.
Bodmer papyri. Okay, so the Bodmer papyri are a collection of papyri manuscripts that were discovered in Egypt that in the early 20th century, and or well, not as early in the kind of not the earliest 20th century, but before the mid-century. They contain a number of different kinds of documents. We call them papyri, by the way, because the ancient writing material in very ancient Christian times was papyrus, which was manufactured out of the papyrus reed. And so they didn't use paper. They had a way of taking these plants and making them into a writing surface. It was very, very good, nearly as good as paper in many ways. But so the oldest manuscripts of Christianity are on papyrus. And so the Bodmer papyri were very significant for a lot of reasons. One is that they contained copies of a number of some of the books of the New Testament, and also other books. And so they do include books of some of the unusual Catholic epistles, first and second. I think it's First and Second Peter and James. Which is significant because these books were not widely circulated early on, but these do date from, they're usually dated around the year 200 or so. And so they were very early. They are fragmentary in nature. They do include large sections of Luke and John, and are our earliest copies of Luke and John. And they're not complete copies of Luke and John, so they're fragmentary. They've got fragments. That fragment is called P75. It's the 75th papyrus. So it's P for papyrus, the 75th that was cataloged, and it's an excellent manuscript of Luke and John that helped confirm what scholars have been long saying, such as the woman taken into adultery wasn't really originally there, and other things. This P75 is a very accurate manuscript by what we can tell. There's another manuscript called P66, which also has John in it, that is a highly sloppy manuscript. That the scribe made tons of mistakes and corrected his mistakes all over the place, and then another corrector came in and corrected mistakes. It shows that some scribes were more careful around the year 200, and some were not, either because they were incompetent or they were sleepy or they didn't care or whatever. I mean, they weren't trained as well. I don't know, but so yeah. So this papyrus collection though does include other writings, and it's very interesting because there are evangelicals who will say that since First and Second Peter and James are in this Bodmer papyrus, that shows that Christians considered them to be canonical scripture. The problem is that this manuscript that has First and Second Peter and James in it also has books that are not in the New Testament, like the Psalms of Solomon and Third Corinthians. It's like well, yeah, okay, that doesn't work because we're going to say those are therefore canonical, so were the others then. And so, but yeah, so it was a major find, and that was significant, especially for New Testament textual critics trying to get the earliest manuscripts of the New Testament.
Thank you so much. I apologize for this exam that we're testing your memory, aren't we?
Bring the zingers on. Let's go.
We're already in. Question number 6. What is your opinion regarding Christianity's impact on preserving the Greek and Roman literary and cultural heritage once it took full effect, if you will, of the Roman government around the latter half of the 4th century? For example, it is estimated well over 95% of the Roman and 90% of Greek pagan writings were destroyed or otherwise not recopied for posterity. Christians thought many of these writings were from the devil. It is known roving monks on occasion would burn books, which church leaders encouraged followers to purge their libraries of pagan material. Christian mobs in Alexandria helped destroy the pagan Serapeum and participated in the murder of pagan philosopher Hypatia in 415. The only Roman novel to survive in its entirety is in Metamorphosis, the Golden Ass by Apuleius, yeah. Even though many more such works were written, the ribald Satyricon only survives in fragments. Even important works from such ancient pagan authors as Livy, Tacitus, Archimedes have major lacunae. while the complete works of others are only known through citations?
It's a really, really good question, and it's really difficult to answer. Um, there, there's a huge loss of Greek and Roman literature um, that we would love to have. Um, just to give you one example, one further example, my brother is an expert on the Roman playwright Plautus, who is a very, very funny author. He writes these plays that are outrageously funny, and some of them are kind of bawdy. They're like a little raucous, and so they're really good. But most of his plays we just have in little fragments. And so, like my brother, one of the things he's done, my brother's a classicist, but what he's done is he's taken, like, he'll just have a line or two, and he'll try and figure out what the entire plot of the play was based on, and so, like, you got to do that. And you hear about all sorts of things that people wrote. We don't have them anymore. Um, my view is that Christian book burnings, where Christians were burning books, were few and far between. Um, I don't think it happened often. There certainly were some bishops who might have encouraged that kind of thing, and you actually get it in the Book of Acts, right? There's this in the Book of Acts, you get this book burning of these magic books, and so sometimes books were seen to be dangerous and they were destroyed. More often, they simply weren't copied. Um, I mentioned that our oldest books were on papyrus. Papyrus was a good writing material, but after a few hundred years, you know, before we had acid-free paper, if you get a book that was written 200 years ago that wasn't as isn't it, it starts crumbling, and papyrus is like that. So if you don't copy, say a treatise of Seneca, if you don't copy, if somebody doesn't copy it, then it just disappears. So you don't have to destroy it, just don't copy it. And that happened a lot. And one reason it happened a lot is because in the Middle Ages, when books were being copied in the West, and in the East, in what had been the Roman Empire, in that area, um, Christian areas, books were being copied by those who were literate, and about the only people who were literate were scribes, and the scribes were in Christian monasteries. They were monks. And so if you've got a monk in the year 1200, and he's got a choice of copying the letters of Paul or the plays of Plautus, which is he going to do? He's going to copy scripture or some like pagan thing. He doesn't. And so so they didn't copy these things very often, and it's a real shame. To put it in another perspective, though, I should point out that the vast majority of early Christian literature was also lost. I mean, just a minute ago, I mentioned like Paul's opponents. Some of them obviously wrote letters. I mean, they wrote things, but we don't have any of them. And you just think about Paul himself. This is a really kind of interesting thought experiment. So we have in the New Testament, we have 13 letters that claim to be written by Paul, and scholars debate some of them, but most critical scholars today think that 7 are certainly by Paul, and the other 6 are either doubted or weren't written by Paul. Most critical scholars say he didn't write 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, and probably not Ephesians, Colossians, and 2nd Thessalonians, and they have arguments for this, right? There are reasons for thinking that. But let's just say that Paul wrote, we have 7 letters from Paul. They're called the 7 undisputed letters. So in the New Testament, Paul's associated with a lot of churches. He founds a bunch of churches, and he certainly founded churches we don't hear about in either his letters or in the book of Acts. So how many churches did Paul have? Let's say he had a ministry of 30 years. Let's say that he founded 20, 25 churches. How often did he write each church? Well, we have evidence he's writing the Corinthian church repeatedly. And so let's just say he wrote each church twice a year over the course of 30 years. Okay? Okay, you've got 20 churches. He writes each of them twice a year. That's 40. And he did it for 30 years. That's 1,200 letters. We've got 7. And that's only if he's writing them twice a year. It's like, I mean, and that's one guy. And so, I mean, it's like, oh my God, we have, it's been a huge loss, the Roman and Greek literature. It's also a huge loss that we don't have more Christian stuff.
Thank you for answering that. And that it makes you really think. It makes you wonder what we don't have.
Oh my God.
Question number 7. With the recent advances in forensic science, can examples be cited where this technology has been applied to ancient documents or other artifacts from early Christianity? Carbon-14 dating has been used for decades to determine the approximate dates of some manuscripts and other artifacts containing carbon, the most famous example being the late dating of the Shroud of Turin. However, recent developments in DNA analysis means usable profiles can be obtained from as few as a half dozen viable cells, while advances in spectral analysis suggest previously unreadable writings on palimpsest can be deciphered. Another tool is ink diffusion analysis, which can be used to ascertain whether a document is ancient or modern forgery. This technique, which I love this example, was employed to help show the Mormon documents discovered by Mark Hoffman and sold to the LDS Church during the 1980s were in fact modern forgeries.
Yeah, a lot of these technologies are being used. You're right about carbon-14. It's New Testament scholars have always been reluctant to apply carbon-14 because it destroys the specimens. You don't have to take like a whole manuscript to destroy it, but you do have to take little snips. And so when the Gospel of Judas was discovered, and it became public, people probably know about this. I don't know when it was, maybe I don't know, 10, 12 years, I forget, 14 years, I forget how long ago, but I was involved with that. And National Geographic wanted me to be on the team that was examining it. And they they called me up and they said, we found this, they started out by saying, do you, what do you know about the Gospel of Judas? I said, well, we don't have a Gospel of Judas. Isn't Church Fathers mention it? This National Geographic woman's on this phone and asked me what I think of the Gospel of Judas. And she said, well, would you think it's significant if we found it? Would I think it's significant? Yes, it'd be significant if we found it. Are you kidding me? She said, well, we think we got it. I said, okay, good. And so they gathered a team together. They got a coptologist, Stephen Emmel, who could verify and could examine the manuscript per se, and they had me to kind of situate it in the context of early Christianity, and so they had these people. But this woman on the phone, she says, "Well, what we really want to do is date the manuscript." And I said, "Well, for that you need a Coptic paleographer." She said, "Oh, okay. What's a Coptic paleographer?" I said, "A Coptic paleographer is somebody who's an expert in Coptic, the language this thing's written in the ancient Egyptian language, and a paleographer is somebody who dates manuscripts based on handwriting analysis." She said, "Well, we're wondering if you could help us with the carbon-14 dating." Could I help you with the carbon-14? I'm not a scientist. I'm a biblical scholar. What? And I said, so they found a guy. They found a person in at Arizona who does this kind of thing. And so, but you have to take little pieces, and to do the carbon-14, you got to destroy the pieces. So you don't want pieces that have writing on them, right? But you have to take a bunch of different. So yeah, so already back. So this was years ago. They were doing that then, but they do multispectral analysis now. I don't know about them doing DNA analysis on manuscripts. I'm not sure how you control that because of course, people are handling manuscripts for centuries, and presumably the DNA would be contaminated. The Shroud of Turin, I think it's a no-brainer. Yeah, it's a medieval forgery, and so I know people are saying, "Oh no, it was all messed up and stuff," but no, not in my judgment.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I just did an interview on that actual topic with historian Andrea Nicolotti, and he goes through the history and shows that there's nothing before the 6th century of even mentioning a shroud, and then there are many shrouds. So there's already a scandal going on with creating these relics. But yeah, okay, so we're going to shift subjects to Hebrew Bible, but before we do, one interesting comment / question. With the recent launch of the Webb Space Observatory, some astronomers are predicting there's a good chance we will know within the next 25 years or so if there are other intelligent life forms within the universe. If this happens and we are still around, what impact do you think this might have on Christianity or religion in general, for that matter, Dr.
Ehrman? Well, it depends what one means by intelligent life forms. I'd be amazed if there aren't some kind of life forms out there, because I mean, our our galaxy has 100 billion stars in it, and it's one of, I mean, there are different estimates about how many hundreds of billions of galaxies there are, and so surely, even if it's by chance, but the fact, the likelihood that they're anything like us is completely remote and improbable, I think. So, in some way, I mean, a parrot is intelligent, but I mean, it's not going to affect people's religion. If they find high intelligence, then people will have to account for it. And religion is very flexible. Religion can adapt itself and maintain its basic criteria, and it typically does. And if you want to see one kind of conservative Christian's view of how that happens, then C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy, where you get actually people do have other kind of religions based on what their own situations are and different. And so God would also reach out to these space people, and maybe it wasn't Jesus, maybe I don't know. so yeah, it wouldn't kill religion, I don't think.
Thank you so
Although
much.
the space people might kill us.
Yeah, I was gonna say, what if they came and they heard us talking about trying to convince them about this idea that we have about a God, and they're like far more advanced, and they're like, "What are you talking about? What if
Yeah.
What if imagine them trying to say, no, you got this all wrong. We know how the universe, like, we have far more understanding of this that we live in." That would be interesting if we could take some notes.
That would be great. Obviously, if our minds could get around it, but I think the more likely thing is that if we find intelligent life, we may well damage it, because we have a huge history of colonializing peoples that are inferior to us, and I think that would be a real danger. Although how we would possibly get there is another question. I mean, as I understand, what little I understand about speed of light, Einstein, general relativity is like, we wouldn't be able to get there anyway. So it's like,
right. Yeah. We'd have to start now and wait, I don't know how long before our generation's generation. Exactly.
No, generation. We're talking no.
Unbelievable amount of time.
If you've got millions of light years away, it takes millions of years to get there. If you're going the speed of light, and nothing can go faster than the speed of light. That's the whole point. So if you ain't going 866,000 miles a second, so
yeah. Well, shifting gears to Hebrew Bible, Old Testament studies and things like that. And this might be where we really stretch your memory. I don't know. We'll see. Hopefully I'm not pushing too far. First question I have: why do scholars consider the book of Zechariah a product of multiple authors, as was the case for the Pentateuch, Isaiah, and Daniel? We get those, but Zechariah.
With all of these books, we have similar criteria for how we decide. In some books, it's easier to demonstrate than others. But the way we do it is, what you need to imagine is, suppose you've got two novelists. Suppose you got Charles Dickens and Mark Twain, and they both written something, and somebody later takes some pages from Dickens and some pages from Twain, and they sew them together into a book, and they don't tell you you've done that. When you're reading through that book, all of a sudden things change. The writing style changes, the topics change, the ideas change, and you think, this don't sound like the same guy to me. Well, yeah, maybe he's just maybe approach things differently. Maybe decided to try a different writing style now. Maybe decided to talk about something else now. And so you have to consider all the possibilities. But this is the case with Zechariah. The first probably 2/3 of it is from an earlier prophet. Second 2/3, the first 2/3 of it sounds a lot like kind of what we can situate in kind of what you think of classical prophecy. The second part of it, I think it's chapters 9 to 14, especially 10 to 14, have more kind of an apocalyptic flavor to them, and so they're sometimes thought about as being kind of preliminarily apocalyptic. So they're not quite as apocalyptic as like Daniel chapter 7 or something, but they're kind of leaning in that direction. And so you get passages like that. You get a similar phenomenon in Isaiah. Most people who are familiar with biblical scholarship, at some level, might remember that scholars are pretty sure that there are three Isaiahs: first and second and third Isaiah. That first Isaiah is chapters 1 through 39, etc. But fewer people know that within first Isaiah, there's a section, chapters 24 to 27, that's called the Little Apocalypse, that's like the end of Zechariah. It doesn't fit into its 8th century context in terms of its ideas, its thoughts, its theology, its understanding of things, its writing style. And so people think this was inserted. And so for all of these books, this is the kind of detective work that scholars do. And they do it at a really sophisticated level. And so it's not the kind of thing where you could just like read your English Bible and say, yeah, I don't think that's right. I mean, you can say that, a lot of people do, but you've got to, you got to know the languages, and you got to dig in there, and it is complicated. It's complicated work. And it doesn't mean that it's necessarily right, but to evaluate, really to evaluate it, you've got to be able to do that level of work.
Thank you so much. Next question. Why was the Rassi Song of Songs included in the Old Testament canon? Was it because the priest thought it was written by Solomon?
Right. So it is interesting in our Old Testament that there are several books that are thought to be written by Solomon, and there are books from outside the New Testament, the Old Testament. That were thought to be written by Solomon, and some of them make better sense than others. The book of Proverbs, Solomon was known as a very wise man, so well, he wrote a bunch of Proverbs, so that makes sense. Book of Ecclesiastes claims to be written by Solomon. It just says, I mean, he doesn't say my name is Solomon, but he says that he's the son of David, who's the king in Jerusalem, who's like the wisest, richest man ever to live. Let me see, who might that be? So he's claiming to be Solomon, and it's not written by Solomon. Song of Songs is an interesting case because on one level, there's really nothing about it to make you think Solomon. I mean, it's about a young man who is passionate about a young woman. They're both gorgeous. They are just like in flaming love with each other and want to have sex. And there's all sorts of innuendos in there you don't get in English translation because translators are afraid to translate it. Because oh my God, really? That's what it says? Ha! And so I don't think it got in because people thought Solomon wrote it. I think people started revering it as a sacred book, and the reason they did that is because they started to allegorize it. So that in ancient Israel, the standard allegory was that this is not talking about a young man and a young woman who have the hots for each other. This is talking about God's love for his people Israel, that he is passionately in love with them, and he just wants to do anything for them. And with that reading of it, then it takes on a completely different tone. It's no longer a love poem per se. And so it gets accepted in, but then you have to ask, well, okay, but who wrote the thing? If you attribute it to Solomon, that adds weight to its authority. Christians then take it over, of course, because it's in their Old Testament too. And the Christian allegory was typically Christ's love for the church. Rather than God's love for Israel. And so that's how, still, I think a lot of Christians read it that way and don't realize what it is they're reading. It's like rated, not quite rated X, but it's getting up there. It's a high R, let me tell you.
I mean, it is kind of funny, like, if it seems that it's implied that this is definitely a sexual, very, very in love type sexual book. It's kind of a joke, though. I think it's funny, is what I'm trying to get at. It's not like to mock, but it's like, you have turned something that was like practically an ancient Playboy into sacred literature. And I mean, I guess that happens a lot, that happened throughout history. So,
well, I'm glad they did it. I mean, I love it. I love the book, and it's great that it's in the Bible because otherwise nobody would read it. And, I suppose you could say that about a bunch of different books of the Bible. Like when you actually read them and just isolate them and read them for what they have to say, think, wow, that's in the Bible, including, Ecclesiastes, another book that Solomon allegedly wrote. Oh my God, that takes a contrary view to things than most of the Hebrew Bible. But yeah.
Thank you so much. Next question we have is it true some Old Testament passages have been boulderized, if you will, by translators to soften otherwise X-rated material, which is kind of what we're talking about? For example, is it true that when Abraham made oaths beneath his thigh and Ruth lay between the feet of Boaz, these were euphemisms to disguise the fact the subject referenced was a more intimate part of the male anatomy?
Yes, these certainly were references to genitals, but the Hebrew words themselves use euphemisms. And so with Ruth, it literally says feet. It doesn't say genitals. And so it'd be like today, if you say, yeah, so I guess people don't say the same word we used to say, so and so kicked the bucket, right? It means they died. Uh, and it's not that a translator putting that into French. If they translate it into French as he kicked the bucket, that's the literal French. He's not bowdlerizing it. He's just translating the English. It's a euphemism, or a more common one today. He passed. He passed away, instead of saying he died. So the euphemism is in the original in these cases, not the fault of the translator. There are places where translators do kind of soften it up a bit, especially, for example, in the Song of Solomon. And it's especially interesting, by the way, people won't know this, but it happens in the writings of the early church fathers. Some of the church fathers describe, we were talking about heresies earlier, and how you have these heresies, and you have these church fathers that attack heresies. And one of the things they do is they claim that these heretics are all a bunch of perverts, and they go into some length to describe what it is these heretics do in the ritual services. When the edition of the church fathers appeared in the 1900s, I'm sorry, in the 1800s, in the 19th century, in the Ante-Nicene Fathers series, there are sections, for example, in the book of Clement of Alexandria, that the translators refused to put into English, and so what they did is they translated them into Latin. So the English translation has entire chapters that are in Latin. And the reason they're in Latin is because that means only scholars can read them, and they're not going to be like hiding them under the bed at night to kind of pull them out. There's like, whereas if you put this in, you let regular people read this, oh my God, you don't want them reading this stuff.
Wow. It
Yeah.
seems that Christians still carry on that tradition. If you're not a Christian, you just want to be a pervert. I'm just joking. Not all. There are some fundamentalists, is my point, that actually use that.
Yeah. No, you have no morals if you don't believe in God, because
Yeah.
why would you have morals?
Silly. Next question. Do mainstream scholars believe Ruth, Esther, and Jonah are examples of Jewish fiction?
This is a complicated question. I don't think I've ever seen any discussion of it, except for, I've written about this a little bit, but not about those three books. But the reason it's complicated is because ancient languages didn't have a word comparable to our word fiction, and they didn't quite have the same concept we have. So let me explain. I've had to deal with this in my work on ancient forgery. Um, because I had to deal with genre issues and what kind of writings are these? Are these meant to be factual? Are they meant to be stories that didn't really happen? So they did know about stories that didn't happen, but they didn't have like this category that we have, like this work is fiction. Um, so in our thinking today, we have different kinds of genres of writing, and so somebody can write a novel or a short story or a limerick poem or a front page news article in the New York Times or an op-ed or a sports column. All of these things are different kinds of writing, and there are no kind of legal law. There are no laws about how to do it, but there are these kind of expectations of, if you're writing a sports page column, if you're writing about last night's football game, your first paragraph will summarize basically the whole thing, and then you do the play-by-play, and people expect that. And if you're doing a science fiction novel, you have all this stuff that didn't really happen, but the reader doesn't think it really happened because they know it's a science fiction novel. And so with genres, there's this kind of unspoken agreement between an author and his or her readers about what this kind of writing is going to be. And if you know what kind of writing it is, then you expect them to follow it. And so that's why you don't have biographies of, say, Abraham Lincoln negotiating the Civil War with the Martians, because that would violate what biographers are supposed to be doing. Biographers don't talk about spacemen. It's just like, and so it has a different thing. Whereas if you're reading a science fiction novel, you will never find a science fiction novel that is 14 lines long with certain rhyming and rhythm, like a sonnet, because that's different. And so you have these rules. And the question is, what did ancient authors think of their rules when they wrote genres? Because they had genres, and there were no laws about it. But so the question is, when somebody's writing Ruth, what do they think they're doing? Do they think that they're presenting this great story that has great meaning in it? Do they think that they're recording a historical event that transpired centuries earlier? What do they think? And the only way to know is to get hints from the text. And most of the time, these texts don't give us enough hints to let us know, in my opinion. I don't think we know whether the authors of Esther or Ruth thought they were writing interesting stories that didn't happen, or if they thought these were things that did happen. And the interesting thing is, you can say the same thing about many of the Gospels. For example, just stay outside the New Testament for a second. The infancy Gospel of Thomas, where Jesus seems to be, he's this 5-year-old wunderkind who has these supernatural powers, who can zap his friends when they irritate him, or he can wither his teachers when they're to show that he knows more than they. Is it meant to be what we would call fiction? They didn't have a word for fiction, but did they think this would happen? How would you know? I mean, you have to guess. And so I don't know about Ruth and Esther. So yeah.
What about Jonah? Before we jump off, same thing, same category, kind of.
Yeah, it's the same category. On my blog lately, I've been talking. I guess a few weeks ago, I was talking about short stories in the Old Testament, and I talked about all these and talked about what they were doing and stuff, and what great stories they are. But I don't think we can get into the author's mind and know what they were doing. You can for other writings. I mean, for other writings, you can say, yeah, actually, he's trying to describe something that happened, whether it did or not. That's what seems to be what he's trying to do, and so yeah.
Thank you. All right. Next question. How does current scholarship respond to the theory the scroll found in the temple during the reign of Josiah, as mentioned in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, was Deuteronomy, and that the books from Joshua through Kings were compiled by one author, a view advanced by Martin Oth?
Yeah. So I think it still continues to be thought that maybe not like completely our book of Deuteronomy, but some kind of book like Deuteronomy would be what is being referred to in 2 Kings when Josiah discovers this. So Josiah is undertaking a religious reform because the people of Israel have started worshiping other gods. They're all sorts of worshiping practices. They're not following the law of Moses, and and he thinks that the problems the nation's having are because they're not worshiping Yahweh correctly. And so he decides to reform it. He's going to repair the temple. He's going to get these other cults out of there and stop all the craziness that he considers to be craziness of other religions. And in the process of that, as they're kind of redoing the temple, renovating the temple, they find this book, and it's called the Book of the Law. And scholars have long thought that this is something like the Book of Deuteronomy that was probably edited later, but into our Deuteronomy. So Martin Noth was this German scholar who thought that there's continuity between Joshua, Judges, First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings. Those books. In the Hebrew Bible, those are just 4 books. First and Seconds are the same. So this is called the Deuteronomistic History, or the Deuteronomic History, which is a collection of books probably written by one author that is showing the history of Israel from the time that Moses died and they started conquering the Promised Land, going all the way through to the fall of Judah at the hands of the Babylonians at the end of 2 Kings. And so basically it's a history of ancient Israel and ancient Judah, starting out as a unified nation and then splitting after the death of Solomon into 2 nations. And then the northern nation is being destroyed by the Assyrians in the 8th century, and the southern kingdom, Judah, being destroyed by the Babylonians in the 6th century. And so there is continuity among these books, and it's still seen that way. They're seen as continuous, with some editing probably going on. But yeah, I think that's still an accepted idea.
Thank you. Thank you so much. What's your opinion regarding the cult of Asherah, a woman deity worshipped mainly on the rural areas, who was possibly considered the wife of Yahweh? This is a position advanced by Dr. William Deaver, among others, and is based on archaeological discoveries of her figurines in areas where Yahweh worship occurred.
Yeah, I don't have any independent evaluation of it. I've been convinced that something like that's probably right. That Asherah does appear to be, it's definitely a female divinity. Um, she is there are passages in the Old Testament that condemn Israelites for worshiping her. Uh, there are reasons because of archaeological discoveries for associating her with Yahweh, and so I think there's a widespread view among experts that in fact she was seen in some circles as the wife of Yahweh, which is scandalous. But um, we have all sorts of scandals when it comes to both men and women and to the Bible.
Thank you so much. All right. What is your position regarding the historicity of the patriarchs, the Exodus, and the conquest? Archaeological excavations and studies over the past 40 years have failed to provide support for these personages and events. Instead, the lands of Judea and Israel appear to have been gradually settled in waves over many centuries, along the lines of first proposed by Albert Alt. Some scholars have even argued by the time of David, the population density of Judea was still so low, his empire was probably limited to Jerusalem and its immediate environs. Like the source would be The Bible Unearthed by Finkelstein and Silberman.
That's a great book, by the way, that your people ought to read. These are two bona fide scholars, uh, yes, Finkelstein and Silverman. It's a great book, and I will never disagree with anything those two say. I disagree with something, but it's a really good book.
Yeah.
I so um, I don't know if we're going to talk about. Are we going to talk about my course at some point?
We need to mention it, actually.
I'm going to be lecturing on this very topic. I'm doing a course. You can say more about it if you want, but I'm going to be doing a course that I've just announced that will be a study. It's going to be how scholars read the Bible, but I'm starting off with a 6-lecture. The first part of it is going to be a 6-lecture course on Genesis, and then I'm going to do the rest of the Pentateuch in 6 lectures, and then I'm going to do something on what happens next and the conquest, the conquest, the settlement, and all that kind of thing. The Bible is quite clear that there was an Exodus under Moses, and in the book of Numbers, we're told that there were over 600,000 men who had been in slavery, and their wives and children leave. 600,000 soldier-age men who escaped from Egypt, and and so what are we talking about? I mean, 2.5 million people or something left Egypt, and they wandered around in the wilderness for 40 years, and then they conquered the Promised Land in the book of Joshua. And so this is the heart of the biblical story in some ways for the Hebrew Bible, the narrative. And I'll be evaluating the historical reliability of that. These biblical stories have been called into question seriously since the 19th century because of archaeological discoveries and because of internal tensions within the stories themselves and the plausibility of there being 2.5 million people who escaped slavery that aren't mentioned in any source. People will say, well, the Egyptians ain't going to mention that. It's like, boy, they took it on the jaw on that one. So but there are very good reasons for wondering if that's the case. And so I'll be lecturing about those things and talking about evidence and what we know. And then, once people know the evidence, then they can make up their mind. Was there really a battle of Jericho where the walls came tumbling down? Was there a city of Jericho that had walls at the time? Well, there are ways to find out these things. And so we'll be talking about all that in my course.
I hope everybody joins the course. It also begs the question of, was there a Joshua? Was there really, some of these characters?
Yeah.
And
well, you started out asking me about the patriarchs.
Right.
I mean, there's no evidence, of course, that there were Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. There's no external evidence for that. Our only evidence is in the Bible itself, and so there are all sorts of issues that one has to address, such as if Abraham, if you follow the biblical chronology, he must have been living in the 18th century BCE. Scholars are pretty sure that our earliest source for Abraham would be what's called the J source of the Pentateuch, and it would be about 800 years later.
Mm-hmm.
And so I try to put this in comparative terms. Like if you find somebody today who's our first source for somebody living in the year 1300, like we don't have there aren't any other sources. It's like somebody writes about somebody living in 1300. This is the first time you hear of him. What do you make of that? say, well, in the
Yeah.
ancient world they have more oral cultures. Yeah, okay. So you have to weigh all that and
And
evaluate.
he's only 99 having his first child. I mean, that's very plausible, is it not?
But
Well,
if it's a miracle, it don't matter how old he is.
that's true. That's true. That's I think that's the point of all of them. I think we have time maybe for one more. What is your position regarding the hypotheses that the Israel God Yahweh was derived from the more ancient Canaanite gods, El, the sky god, and Baal, the god of storms and battles?
I don't think Yahweh was derived from El and Baal or Baal. I think that he was I think that he was a divinity among a group of people who lived in that region, just as there were other groups that worshiped El and Baal. And so I think that there were numerous gods being worshipped. These were all polytheists in the ancient world, and the followers of Yahweh eventually took over that part of the world. Eventually, and they incorporated religious practices and beliefs of other peoples into their own, and so you have Yahweh being called all these things.
Thank you. All right. If I may, just to put the icing on the cake, did Canaanite tribes the Israelites encounter also practice harem, the practice of exterminating all enemies following a battle, with possible exception of young women, of course, the virgins? According to the Old Testament, the Israelites did so. So I didn't know if. I guess that's. Oh, go ahead.
No, it's a good question. Was this a common practice? I don't know. The reason the Israelites do it is because they are the reason they do it in the Bible. I'm not saying they really did it, but in the Bible, the reason they do it is because Yahweh cannot allow his people to start worshiping other gods, and so you can't have foreign influence. That idea, so far as we know, was not shared by other peoples in what they called Canaan at the time. And so I don't think that that this principle probably was followed, and I don't think we have any evidence that it was followed by anybody else. And there's actually not much. There's no evidence the Israelites followed it, because I mean, even in the Bible, it's clear that lots of Canaanites are still alive later, and so they didn't destroy everybody.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ehrman, for your time. Ladies and gentlemen, check out the series. It's coming soon. Every one of my descriptions is going to have access for you to go take the course with Dr. Ehrman, learn something about these things, especially those who want to wield themselves with some knowledge on understanding the biblical narrative. You know, you get harassed by fundamentalists. Why don't you learn a thing or two? That's often my audience.
Can I say just one thing about it? If they want to just look it up on their own, just look up bartehrman.com /courses, and they can find it. And also, for those who haven't heard, I also have a blog where I do this kind of stuff all the time. The kind of questions Derek's asking me, I get questions like this every day. And since 2012, this is my 10th year, I've answered every question I've gotten. And so think about joining my blog. It's used to raise money for charity, and so I don't get anything off of it, but it raises money.
The ultimate question is, what does he think about me after all of this harassing that I do to him?
Maybe I should do a blog post on that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ehrman, and I appreciate you, sir.
You're welcome. Thank you. Enjoyed it.
Ladies and gentlemen, join MythVision's Patreon not only to support us, but there are 72 videos that I did with Dr. Dennis R. McDonald and Richard Carrier, all on the Patreon, early access. You guys can ask personal questions when I go to interview these scholars, and you're helping MythVision grow.